Recording in progress. Really excited to be here today. Carlene Thomas, fantastic to have you here. And we're going to be having a great conversation today about bilingual literacy, bilingualism as a superpower, and really thinking about that first language as a strength. And in particular, going to be thinking about this concept of how do we make sure that when we're supporting these emerging bilinguals with home language materials, we're doing that in a way that is supportive? And what are the misconceptions of using home language materials within the classroom that we want to avoid? So exciting to go through this today. We'll be talking about technology tools that can support bilingual education with home language. And so as part of this, I'm the founder of Adaptive Reader. We're a literacy platform that supports bilingual education with multilingual text and multilingual audio. And Carlene here is, wow, her biography is just amazing. It has such a rich background in bilingual education, multilingual education. We actually met along with the National Association of Bilingual Learners Conference, which she helps to coordinate. But she has, among other things, been on the leadership team for the National Newcomer Network. She actually taught as a professor in Beijing, China, for teaching English to speakers of other languages. She's been the ESL Program Coordinator for the state of Texas. And now she is the CEO and founder of an educational consulting company that advocates for equity for multilingual learners. So super excited to have her with us today to explore some of these ideas. And with that, I will hand it over to you to sort of kick us off with some of these foundations.
Love it. Yay. Thank you so much, Ethan. I'm so excited to, be sharing this space with you today. I know that right from the start, when we first met here in my hometown where I live in Austin, at South by Southwest conference, when we first met, I was just so jazzed. I don't know if that's not a cool word to use, but it's fine. I was totally jazzed to hear about what you were developing with Adaptive Reader and all that it has to offer, and just seeing how everything that it has really aligns with what I'm preaching on a constant basis as I work with school districts and state agencies across the country. And so I'm just really excited to talk a little bit about additive bilingualism, right? And so you should see, hopefully on the screen, this quote, this message that I think is so foundational to everything I believe, everything I think we believe, right? And probably each of us on this call believes and knows is vital for our multilingual learners, and that is that additive bilingualism has a place in all of our programs that support multilingual learners, emerging bilingual students. I think a lot of times, it's easy to recognize the reality is in, for instance, in English as a second language program, when we're only instructing in English, by nature, that program's design is subtractive, right? Traditional transitional bilingual programs by design are subtractive. The only by design programs that we have for multilingual learners is a dual language program, right? But what do we just say? Well, for kiddos who are not participating in a dual language program, too bad for you, buddy. No additive bilingualism for you. And I think what I hope that we can message today is that in all of our programs, whether we are instructing in the student's primary language or not, whether the goals of that program have goals of bilingualism and biliteracy like our wonderful dual language programs do or not, guess what? We can still infuse instructional practices that support additive bilingualism in each of those spaces and for all of our students, because each of our emerging bilingual students, multilingual learners, deserve it, right? They deserve that additive bilingualism approach. And so just like Ethan mentioned, sometimes we can have some misconceptions as to what does that look like, particularly in a space like an ESL setting where we're instructing in English. What does that really look like then to incorporate texts that are in students' primary or home language? And what can happen sometimes in these spaces is that we run into a common pitfall with the appropriate use of primary language text. Now, I'm kind of interchanging the terms primary language, home language. We've got native language, heritage language, and there's lots of nuances between those. We won't dive into that today, but mostly we're talking about when students do have literacy, for instance, in another language than English, whether it was their native language or not, how do we leverage that to support second language or even multilingual education and acquisition? And the misconception can be, well, let's just use that primary language as a replacement, right? We have a brand new student that's just arrived from Japan. And so we're just spinning our wheels, translating everything into Japanese. Go, 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 go. Translating, translating, translating. And maybe we need to have a conversation with the student. What was their educational history back in their home country? Did they receive schooling in English? What is their literacy level in Japanese in this example? Is the translation that we're using even understandable? Is it a bunch of gobbledygook? Does it make sense? And we sometimes can spin our wheels just replacing. And instead, I want to really pose to us that instead we think about using those primary language texts and resources as a supplement, to support. And now, of course, again, I'm talking really specifically about spaces where there's not instruction in the student's primary language. Absolutely, within dual language spaces, when we're instructing in the student's primary language, we're still going to use many of the content-based language instructional methods of instruction to support that marrying of content and language, because we know our students, even if they do have proficiency in the other language, may not be literate in that language, right? So we're also going to talk when students do have literacy in that other language, or maybe when they don't have full literacy, but how do we really support those primary language texts? And so this is what we're going to dive into. And what I want us to now take a look at is I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to let Ethan take over here a little bit. And Ethan, I'd love to have you just kind of show everyone what Adaptive Reader provides. And then we'll kind of jump in with what does this mean to our pedagogy in the classroom to support that added bilingualism lens?
Absolutely. And I think the first thing that I want to sort of start off and ground in when we're talking about adaptive reader. So adaptive reader is really designed to support both linguistically diverse classrooms and neurologically diverse classrooms. And it comes from a very personal place. As someone who went through K-12 with undiagnosed dyslexia, as did other people who were close to me, and for whom that was a significant barrier to engaging in the curriculum. And so the tooling that we've really built is both to support those emerging bilingual students in their journey, but also for neurodivergent students who may have some additional challenge that is creating a barrier for them engaging with grade level content. So not all of these tools are necessarily the right thing for every student, and I want to sort of clarify that. But we're going to hone in really specifically on the things that can be supportive for those emerging bilingual students. So I'm going to start off here by just sharing one of my favorite stories, which this was one of my favorite books in school, and it feels particularly relevant in the age of AI today. So this is our web application, Adaptive Reader. We actually just announced that our entire English language content catalog is free for schools forever, which is a really exciting moment. We try and make this as accessible as possible for students and educators. So students can come in here, they can come in here and read this text. And we have multiple reading levels available, which is what you see first here. And again, this can be particularly helpful in classrooms where you have embedded IEPs, where this is a particularly helpful support. And so our gold version simplifies the vocabulary and sentence structure to make the text more approachable. It changes the reading difficulty of the text about 2 to 3 grade levels. And then our silver brings it down 4 to 6 grade levels. But we also have the ability for students to listen to the text out loud.
These reflections have dispelled the agitation with which I began my letter, and I feel my heart glow with an enthusiasm which elevates.
And so not only can they listen to the text out loud and read it, these differentiated versions of the text in English, we also enable students to read the text in their home language. So this is one of our Spanish adaptations.
Estos pensamientos me han calmado. Ahora tengo un objetivo en el que enfocarme. Realizar este.
And so within the sort of classroom, students are able to access these multilingual texts at multiple reading levels in their home language. Each one of these texts actually is available as a print-on-demand paperback as well, which has been a real focus for us from an equity and inclusion perspective. We talk about dignified differentiation. So we have 90 different versions of Frankenstein that you can order right now. They're printed on demand. They're under $10 per book in each of these languages. This is adaptive reader in Vietnamese at our 6th grade level, and students can scan the QR code on the back of the book, jump to any point in the story, and actually hear it read aloud to them. And then one of my favorite features, we have these little passage markers. So it says 124 right there and 125 down here, about every 100 words or so. So the student can jump to that and listen to it read aloud to them while they're using that printed material. And if you're working within a classroom context where you have students reading multiple reading levels from those IEP plans, multiple languages with different language backgrounds, you can say go to passage 124, and every student is at exactly the same place in the text, and they can come together in a really peer-oriented social way to discuss the content that's happening in the class. And that's a really critical feature for us as well.
Ethan, I get so excited. Didn't want to interrupt you because I was just like, oh, I wanted you to share all of it. I think that this right here is just a perfect example of what we mean by supplement and not replace, right? And how the students can really have agency. And I know that's a pillar. It's a really important component for you all in your product is that students have that agency. They're able to have choice, not only in the level that I want to see in English, but even also the level I want to see in my primary or home language to help support the acquisition. And that it's side by side, not just I have to pick exactly what I'm going to have. And again, I love as well that students can fully then participate in the discussion, whether I've read it in my home language, whether I've read it in another reading level, I can jump to that same point. We could all be there talking about it. It's powerful because it really just demonstrates that, students can leverage whether it's pre-reading in their primary language or the simplified grade level adjusted text, the other level text, or whether they are doing it side by side, whether they're hearing it aloud. They actually may have more oracy in their home language than they actually do literacy. So again, this is another way to say, guess what? Even if it's an ESL setting, I can truly encourage and support the additive bilingualism approach, saying, yeah, you know what? Order. And you gave me this copy, if you remember, when we first met of The Great Gatsby, but like the version you have there, let's order you the Frankenstein book in Vietnamese so that you can be reading that, and not only for the purpose of comprehending the English text, but for extending and maintaining your literacy in that other language, right? Even though in this program that you're in this ESL space or what have you, that we're not instructing in that home language and supporting that literacy directly through instruction. So, man, I get excited, Ethan, because I think overall we're really seeing that we're feeling that comprehension truly happening. I'm gonna let you also. I'm getting excited. Was there anything else you're about to say, Ethan? Before?
Oh gosh, no, I love this so much. And just to that point, right, on comprehension, I think one thing that we hear from teachers again and again, that it's not just about the students' reading comprehension. For so many of these newcomers in particular, it's also about how you send home materials with the student that everyone in the family can engage with so that they're able to fully participate. The parents are able to fully participate. And so I think that's something that's a big part of equity for education as well, like making sure that you're including the supports around that student. And so that's something that we spend a lot of time trying to think about, is how do we make sure that we're meeting every one of these students where they're at and where their families at from a resource perspective.
Wow, Ethan, that actually highlights a huge point. I think sometimes we take for granted, or maybe even just have a generalization that in at students' homes that everyone is either, literate in English or literate in their home language, or that they have resources. We can take for granted whether they do or do not have these things, or we make assumptions when, wow, not only can they bring home a text in that home language, but they could also have it read aloud, right? So the parent can really engage with that text as well and ask the student about it, and building those cognitive skills that transfer across languages that they're acquiring. So wow, that's powerful. I love that lens as well, and that added benefit. I'm going to share the PowerPoint again, Ethan, so you can kind of talk through then summarizing some of these features.
Absolutely. So I think when you're looking at this inputs column here, these are really the three pillars that we think about adaptive reader in terms of adapting, changing these texts to make sure backed by research, right? We're really big proponents of reading into the primary source research here. So we're having these multilingual texts to support those students and think about L1, that first language, that home language, as an asset that can be brought to the classroom. We're thinking about these multi-level texts, right? And there's a lot of research on the benefits of these texts to help get students back on that ramp up to, this isn't about keeping students at one of those lower reading levels. This is about giving every one of these students a chance to practice decoding, a chance to fully comprehend their curriculum material so they're not falling further behind in their comprehension and their skill building outside of literacy. And it's also, I think, a really critical step towards just building that student confidence that, yes, I can decode this. And hey, let's look at the original text now side by side and see what makes that original text harder. What makes that vocabulary harder? And now, now knowing what it's saying by reading this adapted version, how can we now go back through, reread, and process that original version of the text? And then the final pillar, which is really around student choice and around multiple formats, and the fact that we know that different formats support different learners and at different times, right? So we think about it, if you will, we have multi-level, so we can adapt the sentence structure and vocabulary. We have multilingual as another dimension, and then we have multi-format, where we have our digital versions, we have our audiobooks, and then we have this print-on-demand capacity as well, where there's been a lot of research that says that print can actually significantly increase reading comprehension, retention, and focus for many students. So how do we latch onto those benefits while also acknowledging that, hey, digital is really powerful, especially when it comes to audiobooks, dictionary features, and other supports. So we really focus on stacking digital on top of print, and making sure that we're making all of those features, those accessibility tools available to these students and within these classrooms.
So exciting, Ethan. And I think, something you just said about not keeping students at that lower reading level than their grade level, it really just, again, speaks to that idea that we're not just here to get students to basic proficiency. We want students to be not only acquiring academic levels of English, but also the goal of bilingualism and biliteracy, really honoring and extending and maintaining that home language literacy and building that up. Scaffolds sometimes can get so misunderstood, right? And a lot of times when we misuse or overuse translation, we end up just creating crutches rather than scaffolds, right? Scaffolds should eventually come down, right? They should eventually gradually increase the linguistic complexity, right? That's the whole point of the scaffold, right? And that's what this supports, is that I can move up, I can move up, I can move up, whether it's in my home language, whether it's in English, and gradually increase that sentence structure, gradually increase the vocabulary usage, see it side by side. What the power that this has is, again, that student agency. What it also really makes me excited about is students doing the cross-linguistic analysis. That's what's important here too, whether it's cross-linguistic or even across levels in the same language, side by side, being able to see the differences in the sentence structure, the differences in the vocabulary, to pull from it. Not just I've replaced with the translation and I read a translation, but being able to have them right there side by side. I think as teachers, it's important that we use these tools for what they're really intended to do, and not just, well, there it is for you, buddy, go for it, read it, but really showing them how to use that side by side, to use it as a scaffold, to see the cross-linguistic connections. That's where we build those cognitive skills, right? That's where we really increase that biliteracy, for them to see those things. This is why it's better than just giving a cognate list or handing them a bilingual dictionary, right? Because being able to see it like this and make that cross-linguistic analysis is awesome. I also want to not forget, Ethan, to just highlight that, I kind of mentioned earlier how we can kind of just, we've gotten into like Google Translate, just translating everything, and I want to really highlight that straight up translation is just not always beneficial. And so sometimes we need to make sure it's really trans adapted, that it's more than just a straight simplified translation. And really what you guys are doing is that deep language model, right? And do you want to say any more about that? I just want to not forget to mention that, because I think it's another key element that supports true understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the quality of the translations that we're offering these students is so critical, and this is something that I hear all the time, right? I was speaking to a school system in Philadelphia that has 65 languages in the high school, or I go back to Maine, Portland High School has 53 languages spoken in the classroom, and the teachers are going to Google Translate and putting text in there, and what comes out is not necessarily a high quality translation for that student that's doing them a service. And so we've really focused on, we leverage deep language learning models that are trained specifically on a single language. So we have models that are trained very specifically on Spanish to do English to Spanish translation. That gets to, it's not just better than Google Translate, it's significantly better than just ChatGPT for many of these languages. And then we tie all of this together with the highest quality AI audio models that are available for each of these languages. So we pull those from different resources as well to make sure, this technology isn't perfect. It's getting better quickly, but we're out there constantly trying to make sure that we're putting the best available resources forward for students, and that that I think is exactly what you're talking about, and so critical.
I love that. And I think it's just, it's so important that people recognize that when we just sometimes the easiest thing is not always the best thing, right? And it can feel just like it feels like a silver bullet to just translate and hand them a translation, you know. But one, doing so just doesn't facilitate true literacy development in English, let alone their primary language. And it doesn't really support long-term comprehension. And it may again not be just effective at all. And so I know you guys are also working on something where districts can reach out and actually provide you something that they need translated. Is that something you're doing?
Yes, so it's a little, it's early stage. We haven't released or announced this publicly yet, but we're working on self-serve models where teachers and schools can actually upload their own resources. We have these really sophisticated AI models that are able to take those and adapt them into these different languages, into these audio resources, and eventually so that you'll even be able to download those and print those within your classroom. And you can choose to have that text side by side in English and home language or multiple reading levels. So we're trying to develop a really cohesive system around that. And we are accepting some beta school districts into that tooling right now. And really excited, I would say, in these conversations that I feel like I'm on this sort of indefinite listening tour. Because I've learned so much for the past year and a half working on this. And I'm continuing to learn so much from the educators and students and admins that we work with. And so one of the goals for these pilot programs is to work really strongly hand in hand with these teachers, with these students, these admins. And we have a whole editorial team that is devoted to quality control and crafting these materials. And so really making sure that the output is aligned with the pedagogical research and also the very practical application needs of those teachers within the classroom.
Absolutely. I love that. I anytime that, I'm looking at any resources for multilingual learners, and they have any kind of multilingual text, I think it's just so important that we truly understand as those receiving and using these resources that we use them in a way that supports second language acquisition, multilingual education, and supports biliteracy. And I think that's why I'm so proud of the work you guys are doing, because I know that you get that pedagogy part, right? That we're not just here to just make a quick fix translation for everybody with all your stuff, just send it to us, let's translate for you, but really wanting it to truly be a resource that supports that biliteracy and bilingualism. So, oh, it's so exciting. And I know we want to kind of share kind of a summarizing statement, right, from our dear friend, Stephen Krashen. I mean, how can we not talk about Krashen when we're talking about supporting second language acquisition? But he says optimal input focuses the acquirer on message and not on form. The best input is so interesting and relevant that the acquirer may even forget that the message is encoded in another language. And I know that as we've talked and I've looked at the adaptive reader resources, and we really think about what students need out of multilingual text, multi-level text, multi-format text, what they need out of that is to support comprehension, right? To have that agency of choice, to have student interest, right? And to really be able to use their primary language knowledge that's spread across those languages to support that comprehension. It's all about meaning making. That's what we're in the business for, is meaning making. That's what he's saying here, that it's about the message, not the English exactness, right? Those things will come. We're going to increase that linguistic complexity with that scaffolding. But by doing this, by providing those multiple formats, providing the multilingual text and the multi-level text, we can support meaning making and comprehension. And even, Krashen tells us not only just comprehensible input, but compelling input, right? But I can physically hold in my hand, with a different format, or hear it as well, something that's interesting, relevant, and not kiddie looking as well, especially for like our older students who want resources that don't look like a second grader, resource. But especially for some of our older kids, that also helps build that interest and relevancy for them as well. So yeah, so I'm excited just to really talk about this topic today, because I think that when we don't grasp, as educators of multilingual students, or even our neurodivergent students, like you've mentioned, Ethan, when we don't grasp how to not just slap a tech tool on or slap a translated text on, if we don't grasp how to do this in a way that truly supports their literacy, then we're just not going to make the strides that we need to give them the success that they deserve. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to also say to summarize. I'm jazzed up. I don't know why I keep saying jazzed up, but I'm doing it.
No, I love it so much. And I think, the last piece that I'll just sort of focus in there on summary is that for me, it's all about student dignity, very foundationally, very fundamentally. I was one of those kids, I hadn't learned to read at the end of 3rd grade. And I remember being in those IEP pullouts where a teacher would come in and pull you out of the classroom. Every other student knew that you were getting extra help because you weren't meeting those standards. And I think, right, we have to remember how much of education is psychological, right? And that's where we spend so much time in designing these resources, not just the translation, but also like those cover designs. All of our covers look exactly the same. It doesn't say Spanish language version or simplified version on it. And we really try and make sure that within our tooling, and this is supported by a lot of research as well, we're enabling that student agency for the student to choose a level that they can access. It means even if a student might speak Spanish at home, they should still have the agency to say, I want to work with the English language text, right? So much of this is about re-engaging these students who may have had interrupted education or other educational barriers, and making sure that they're able to access this content, use their strengths, use all of their assets, including their first language, in order to grow their confidence. And I know we're just about time for Q&A here, which is really exciting. Just going to put this up on the screen, and I think for Q&A, we can turn the recording off as well. And that way we'll create an open forum here for anyone to express any of the questions that they may have. And I just want to end by thank you so much for joining us. This was such a great and thoughtful session, and I'm so grateful to have you and your expertise here. So
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ethan. I'm just been so excited to get to talk about this today, and I really hope that it benefits others, and ultimately our multilingual learners in the classroom. Yay.